You are now listening to the Soul and Wonder Podcast, episode 36, Meatonomics with Dave Simon.
Welcome to the Soul and Wonder Podcast, where the conduits of the body, depths of the mind, and atlas of the soul are explored with devotion. Through cultural exchange, Christopher and Sara and their guests will deliver sacred wisdom from around the globe, uncovering the hidden gems of conscious living and holistic healing, all to empower you on your journey of self-discovery. And now, here are your hosts, Christopher and Sara.
Well, we are back again.
Welcome to the Soul and Wonder Podcast. We are your lovely hosts, Sara and Christopher.
Are you sick of us yet?
You better not be. They wouldn't be here.
That's true.
Guys, this episode, holy cow. David Robinson Simon, you might know him as the author who wrote the book Meatonomics, which looks at the ways meat and dairy producers manipulate consumers to consume much more animal foods than they would otherwise, brings us a wealth of knowledge in this episode. I'm going to be honest, I didn't know half of this. Did you?
No, it was very inspirational, very enlightening.
Super educational.
Very educational. Definitely touched on a lot of things that we haven't really been previously exposed to. You know, when we talk about veganism, we look at the animal welfare, we look at
environmental
degradation, we look at our health. But are we really looking at the economics behind it?
I never thought to think about it, not once, but Dave really brought a lot of things to light, and I think that you will find this information very valuable, whether you are a vegan or not. This is an interesting episode. But before we introduce to you Dave, guess what, guys? We're a couple weeks into our group enrollment Eat to Thrive that we launched on September 3rd. We only offer that group enrollment a few times a year. So they're doing super well. Proud of our wellness warriors, as usual. And if you're sad you missed the boat, don't worry. We offer private enrollment too. You can always go to www.soulandwonder.com/eat-to-thrive.
And for those new listeners out there that don't know what Eat to Thrive is our full plant-based, whole food plant-based transition program. So people that are looking to transition to a plant-based lifestyle, this is the program for you. It comes equipped with so many different things, everything you basically need to make the transition smoothly and bring out the best in yourself.
And we're your cheerleaders along the way. Whether you do group enrollment or private, you better bet you're going to have support. So, thought we should let you know they're doing well in this group enrollment. Check us in January if you'd like to join the next group enrollment. So, David Robinson Simon, who is he? He is a lawyer and advocate for sustainable consumption, and he received his undergraduate degree from the University of California at Berkeley and his law degree from the University of Southern California. In addition to his day job as general counsel for a healthcare company, Dave maintains an active caseload against animal abusers all around the U.S., including lawsuits challenging foie gras producers in New York, ritual animal killers in Southern California, and the U.S. Coast Guard's shooting of cormorants. Am I saying that right? Port birds in the Pacific Northwest. He has also brought more than 20 lawsuits successfully challenging restrictive rules for free speech imposed on animal activists at dozens of venues in California. Did you hear that, animal activists? He's the guy you want in your corner. So, some of the things that we're going to talk about in this episode, obviously, we're going to talk about Dave's journey to veganism and animal advocacy, his whole life path, but we're really going to dive into his book, Meatonomics, which explores the unseen economic forces that drive our animal food system and the weird ways these forces affect consumers' eating, spending, health, prosperity, and longevity. So Dave really breaks down the numbers for us so that we can see exactly at what cost animal foods are produced and how that cost is externalized. It's a lot of numbers, but he does a great job at breaking it down, explaining where everything is going and how, etc. We are going to talk about how these economic forces are influencing health problems like obesity and heart disease. And we're going to get into that hot topic: local and organic animal products versus factory farmed. Also, the government's role in all of this. What are they doing? What are they not doing? What the hell's going on here? And of course, what can we do about all of this? So, strap on your boots, buckle up that seatbelt.
This is information packed.
Absolutely. And of course, stay tuned for the end of the interview for your health tip of the episode. See you later. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Super excited to have David Simon on the show. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're all the way in California, aren't you?
I am.
Nice.
What part of California are you in?
Well, I live at Lake Tahoe, the
beautiful.
largest alpine lake in the contiguous United States. So.
It's gorgeous up there. I was up there maybe about 3-4 years ago, hiking through Yosemite and headed up to Tahoe for a bit. It's a great area.
Yes, I'm quite fond of it.
That's awesome. I still need to make it out that way. One of these days. It's on the list.
Okay. Well, let me know.
Sure. So, Dave, before we dive into your book, we'd like to know what inspired you to walk the path that you're on. You know, you're so active in your advocacy for sustainable consumption and many other things. I love your bio is quite impressive. So, what inspired you to live this way?
Well, it was almost 10 years ago that I almost by accident watched a documentary about the life of Ingrid Newkirk, who is the founder and CEO of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. In the course of watching the movie, I admit that I was somewhat shocked and surprised that a person would, for example, give up eating meat just because he or she believed in something so strongly. And I just couldn't fathom why somebody would do that. And after I finished watching that documentary, I went to PETA's website and watched some short videos about factory farming and how animals are treated when they're raised for meat, dairy, eggs, other sources of their body products in this country and other industrialized countries. And it just stunned me. I really didn't have any idea that I was contributing to that system. And sort of that night, I decided I didn't want to anymore. So that led me on this path of adopting a plant-based diet. And that diet and lifestyle change has sort of driven a lot of my activity over the last decade.
Wow. You know, and it's funny because I think that we can relate in the same way that we never thought about the correlation between, you know, I mean, I just never thought about the way animals were treated to get that steak on my plate, you know, before I became vegan. And it took someone else in our lives to be able to show us that. And then you start asking all those questions and you start doing the research on your own. And it's just astounding the information you can dig up.
Well, and it's also just removing those blinders and taking those off for the first time, and you're being exposed to something so great and so powerful. And it's hard to go back to your, what we call quote unquote past life, you know?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the experience that I had. Yeah.
So your book, Meatonomics, awesome book. I think that this is something our listeners really need to buy. What is this book about?
So Meatonomics looks at the hidden forces that drive the production of animal foods in this country, and it also looks at the consequences of those forces and the effects that animal food production has on consumers in the United States.
This is a topic that, once again, I never thought of before. And so, we actually saw you on What the Health, I believe it was. And the topic itself, I was just like, wow, this is something I really want to dig into and understand more about.
Yeah, well, what the Health is certainly a very provocative movie in that it looks at why health providers sort of ignore the role of animal food consumption in U.S. illnesses. It's definitely a very worthwhile film.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, one of the things that you mention with your book is that animal food producers keep retail prices so artificially low. How do they go about this?
Yeah, so this is really a key concept. So let me explain this idea of externalization of costs. If I take my garbage down my driveway and I leave it there for a garbage service to pick up, and I pay them to take my garbage to the dump, I internalize my garbage collection costs. On the other hand, if I drive to a park and just randomly dump my garbage there and then drive away and leave it there for somebody else to pick up, I externalize my garbage collection costs. That is to say, I impose those costs on society. And in Meatonomics, what I show is that animal food producers are externalizing the vast majority of their production costs, which is to say that they are imposing those costs on society. We bear those costs. When they do that, when they make somebody else pay the majority of their cost of production, they are able to lower their retail prices significantly. So one of the calculations that I've come up with in this book is that for every $1 of animal foods sold at retail, animal food producers externalize another $1.70 of their costs, and they impose those costs on society. And the way you can look at that is to say that, for example, a Big Mac that costs $5 at a McDonald's ends up imposing another $13 of externalized costs on society. So that Big Mac has enormous social costs that are not reflected in the mere retail price of that burger.
It's quite powerful.
And what would you say the total costs? What are we looking at here, that we're not seeing?
We're looking at about $414 billion with a B like boy of costs that the animal food producers just in the United States impose on U.S. consumers and taxpayers every year. To put that number in perspective, it's about half of what we spend in the U.S. each year on Social Security.
Wow.
It's much larger than the budgets of many smaller third world countries. It's simply an enormous number.
I can't
even wrap
shocking.
my head around $414 billion.
That's almost $500 billion we're talking about. This is stunning. So can you explain where these costs come from?
Yeah, by far the largest component of that number, about 3/4 of it, is healthcare costs. So in the United States, related solely to consumption of animal foods, we can attribute about $314 billion each year to externalized costs that producers impose on us. That has to do with things like the cost not only of treating diseases like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease that are known to be significantly causally associated with consuming animal foods, but also things like costs of lost wages and lost productivity by people who have to be out from work to have, a triple bypass or some other treatment related to these diseases. Some of the other costs include about $38 billion in government subsidies that we pay each year at the state and federal level in this country to subsidize animal food production, about $37 billion in environmental costs, $21 billion in what I call cruelty costs, and about $4 billion in costs related to fishing.
Wow. It's incredible to hear them broken down like that.
Some big numbers. Yeah.
Absolutely. And So how is the animal food industry any different, though, than other industries externalizing some costs?
Well, that's a great point. It's pretty much impossible.
We got some dogs going on.
The mailman might be here.
That's great. I've got cats on my end.
We have two of those as well.
Gotcha. Every industry externalizes costs to some extent. There's really no way around it. But some externalize more costs than others. We know, for example, the tobacco industry is a huge externalizer of costs, and there's math to suggest that every package of cigarettes that costs an average of, say, a little under $5 externalizes something like $10 in costs. But even industries like electricity production, which relies heavily on coal and petroleum and results in lots of pollution and environmental degradation for extracting resources, even that industry is known to have only about 1/3 the externalized costs of animal food production.
Man.
So it's simply what we can say about animal food production is, compared to any other industry, based on the available data, based on what we know, it produces more externalized costs in the United States than any other industry.
Wow. That's, I mean, there's so many different ways we can like dive into this that my brain, the gears are just turning. Like, once again, this is new information for me. So, a lot of times when we have guests on the show, it's things that we're already very well educated on or are
more of the
interested
health aspect and that sort of
right.
thing. Right.
And so this is just like opening the curtains.
Right. Well, I'm glad you see it that way, because one of the goals I had in writing this book and looking at this topic from this perspective was to provide a different way for people to think about animal food production, because conventionally, many people, particularly those who are already vegan, know that we have sort of the classic three issues. There's the ethical set of issues, there are the nutritional issues, and there are the environmental issues. And this book sort of sought to look at a fourth set of issues, and that's the economic issues.
Well, and it's such a vast topic, and there's subtopics that branch out from each one of those that you had mentioned. So it's such a big topic to cover, and it's nice to see small niches that you've created in this topic overall, and to be able to dive into just this one issue alone, I think is incredibly important.
Well, and even with this, there's like more layers, which is pretty crazy.
Yes.
So how are these economic forces influencing health problems like obesity and heart disease, for example? We all know that we have a huge problem with that right now in our country, particularly.
So we know that animal food producers externalize the majority of their costs, and we know that allows them to sell their products at artificially low retail prices. The result of those very, very low retail prices of animal foods is that Americans are currently consuming something like twice the amount of animal foods that they would otherwise. And we can sort of determine that based on the figures and based on the prices. And what those very high levels of consumption do is they drive very high levels of disease. So in the United States today, 2 out of 3 people is overweight. 1 in 3 has some form of heart disease, including high blood pressure. 1 in 9 has diabetes. A significant number have had, or at some point in their lives will develop cancer. We have some of the world's highest rates of incidence of these diseases, and it's not just a coincidence. We also have one of the world's highest rates of consumption of animal foods on a per capita basis.
And these diseases and problems, health issues that you had mentioned are only getting worse. And the projections out, 10 years from now seem to be
daunting,
very daunting. So
if we continue on the path that we're on.
That's right. And, one of the things that we need to think about, not just individually, but collectively, and from the perspective of policymaking, is how do we encourage people in this country to consume less of these products that are making us sick? and sending us to an early grave. It doesn't seem like a terribly complicated problem. I mean, we face this problem with tobacco. We haven't solved it completely, but we've certainly managed to turn it around. And in 1950, something like 1/2 of adult Americans smoked or consumed tobacco in other ways. And today that figure is down by something like 2/3.
Wow.
So as a combination of aggressive taxation, aggressive messaging, medical community bringing attention to bear, we're on the path to solving the problem with tobacco, and we just need to look at the issues in the context of animal production in the same way. I think we need to get people to reduce their consumption dramatically.
I agree wholeheartedly on that. And I think that, there's a lot of factors at play. And with the tobacco industry, I think what's really important for us to move forward here into hopefully, I know there's a lot of lobbyists that play and things like that, but aggressive messaging is definitely huge. And, I know if you go to Canada and you buy a pack of cigarettes, you see like someone's lungs on there that they've been smoking for 20 years or whatever, and then they're black and they're dying or whatever. And I know that, in this country, having some aggressive messaging coming from the meat industry, whether it's with health, whether it's with the planet, whether it's with the animals, I think that could really help to curb our insatiable desire to keep consuming these products over and over again it's kind of blindly consuming them.
Absolutely.
At this point.
Yeah, it would be great to have some messaging, particularly sponsored by the government, that encourages people to consume less of these products. At the moment, what we have is the opposite. We have our government encouraging Americans to consume more of these products. And notwithstanding that, we know, because the World Health Organization has said that, for example, processed meat is a class 1 carcinogen. Red meat is a class 2 carcinogen. So notwithstanding that we know that we know clinically that these things are bad for us, our government continues to bombard people with messages to get them to buy more of this stuff. It's crazy.
Absolutely. And I want to dive into the governmental, relationship to this a bit later. I want to backtrack for a second. You were talking about the lower prices increase consumption. So some might argue that there are other factors that influence consumption of animal flesh and secretions. Perhaps they care, about the taste, or they just eat it purely out of habit. So what would you say to that?
That's completely accurate. We know that there are many reasons why people buy anything that they buy, not just animal foods, but all the other products people buy. There's a complex set of factors at play, and price is typically only one factor. But there are ways that we can isolate the effect that price has on consumption. And in the case of animal foods, there are a number of studies that have sought to look at so-called price elasticity of demand, just a complicated economics term that looks at when you change price by a certain percentage, how does that affect consumption of the product? And what these studies find is that a 10% move in price, so if you drop prices 10% of beef, for example, that's likely to result in about a 6.5% increase in consumption. And that's fairly consistent across the board. It's a little different for different kinds of animal foods, but in general, if you look at animal foods as a category, we can consistently predict that if we lower prices by 10%, consumption goes up 6.5%, and more importantly, particularly from a policymaking perspective, if we raise prices by 10%, we can expect consumption to go down by about 6.5%.
Wow.
It makes sense.
It does. Now, during your time writing this book, I can imagine you've spent a lot of time researching and doing a lot of, just due diligence around this subject. But while you were doing that, did you look at the trends of the tobacco industry and look at how, what brought them, I guess, I wouldn't say down, so to say, but I mean, the rates of smoking is definitely lowered significantly.
Yeah, I did look at tobacco in a fairly extensive way, because I think it's the best model for what's going on in animal foods, particularly because in 1950, there wasn't even medical consensus yet that tobacco consumption was bad for us. In fact, that if you were to go back in a time capsule and open a magazine in 1950, you might even see magazine ads promoting, cigarettes with slogans like 9 out of 10 doctors recommend Chesterfields for their patients who smoke, stuff like that. And if we look at tobacco, particularly if we look at the way that governments have taxed tobacco over the years, we can see a very, very clear correlation between taxation, which increases the price of tobacco, and as we would predict based on the law of demand, as prices of tobacco have gone up, consumption has gone down commensurately. And as consumption goes down, the incidence of tobacco-related disease has also gone down.
That's interesting. So about this environmental cost, you said about 37 billion, right, for the externalized environmental costs. What exactly are those, that system is generating?
So there are lots of environmental costs associated with animal food production. Most importantly, there's a significant component of climate change that we know is related to producing animal foods. We have things like devaluation of land where property is located near factory farms. We have leaky manure lagoons that either catastrophically or very slowly are leaking their waste into our groundwater and into our rivers, lakes, and streams. We have air pollution. We have degradation of farmland and erosion. And these many problems have been documented through a variety of studies with actual numbers. And based on those numbers and based on the prevalence of animal food production in this country, we can say that that's responsible for about $37 billion each year in damage to our environment.
Wow. What would you say to someone who might argue that, well, even if we all became vegan, there would be, environmental degradation and issues along those lines? What would you say to them?
I would say that's true because all forms of industrial agriculture are bad for the environment. We know that. That's sort of unequivocal. But I would say that a plant-based diet is measurably much less bad for the environment than animal food production because, among other things, producing animal foods takes, depending on the estimate, between 40 and 100 times more water than producing food, equivalent amount of protein for people on a plant-based diet. It consumes more fossil fuels. It generates more carbon output, et cetera. So yes, everything we do on the land in terms of agriculture is ultimately bad for it, but we can have a much smaller environmental footprint on a plant-based diet.
Do you have the exact number of I forget, it's over 1,000 gallons of water per pound of beef? Do you know the exact number of that?
I don't. It's in the book. I don't remember it offhand, and it often gets. I think it often gets misrepresented because people have done the math using liters and gallons and ounces and pounds and kilos. So it is an enormous amount of water. The one sort of graphic metaphor that I recall is that the amount of water necessary to produce one steer is about equal to the amount of water necessary to float a battleship.
Wow.
That's perfect. That's what I was looking for. I want to put that in perspective for the listeners so they really get an idea of what we're talking about here.
That's a lot of water. Yeah.
That's a ton of water.
And I know people are starting to think, well, what about, buying only local or organic animal foods? Will that reduce our environmental impact?
Well, unfortunately, the research just doesn't show that it does significantly. In fact, in a number of cases, the inorganic form of animal food production is actually better for the environment than the organic form. That's because, among other things, it takes longer to raise animals organically than it does inorganically. And when you add time, you add additional stress to the environment, you add additional need for fossil fuel, you add additional carbon output. It also takes more land to raise animals organically than inorganically. And while from an ethical perspective, it's certainly better for animals to have access to more land, we certainly cannot say that from an environmental perspective, it's better for the environment because almost invariably what happens when you pack animals densely onto land is that there are erosion problems. The land is generally compacted in ways that make farming more and more challenging.
Mm-hmm. And it also impacts the neighboring species. I know there's a problem with like poaching of coyotes and skunks and all kinds of other animals that we deem as pests or predators to keep their farmed animals safe.
So it's really a disruption of the local ecosystem that's happening,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't generally talk about a lot of that either. And I think that's really important to mention.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you did mention an interesting number earlier, the 21 billion cost you mentioned associated with cruelty. What does that mean?
So a few years ago, a couple of agricultural economists did a study in which they asked participants to join an actual live auction and to bid with their own money on moving animals from inhumane environments to humane environments. So, for example, people could actually pull out their wallets and spend real dollars to move chickens from battery cages to cage-free environments. They could move sows from gestation crates to crate-free environments. And the reason this study is so important is that there are by contrast, there are lots of surveys and other sort of questionnaire type studies that have been done that ask people the question, what would you be willing to pay to do X, to move chickens from battery cages to cage-free environments? But until you actually get people to open their wallets and pull out their own money, you don't really know what they're going to do. And this study did just that. So taking the data from that study and extrapolating it to look at other forms of inhumane practices in factory farms, I did that math that comes up to about $21 billion that Americans would likely pay to stop the cruelest practices in factory farms.
It's pretty reflective, I think, of our consciousness moving in the right direction. At least, there's progress happening here. But it's like you'd mentioned, the other forms of farming in, the organic and local isn't necessarily better for the environment. And so it's like people are starting to wake up to the fact that these animals are treated so inhumanely. And they want to see something happen from it. I mean, obviously to the point that you calculated $21 billion cost for us to do so. So at least that's a good sign.
Or everybody can just go vegan.
That's right. That would certainly be the best idea.
But that's too extreme. So, a lot of these problems, they really do sound like they should be illegal or at least better regulated. And we touched a bit on the government earlier, how they're actually kind of promoting the consumption of animal products. So what exactly is the government's role in all of this? What are they doing or not doing?
Well, our government has a very complicated relationship to animal food production. The USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, for example, has two conflicting roles. Because on the one hand, it is charged with promoting and growing this industry, which means quite literally, it has a hand in advertising. It has a hand in protecting the U.S. markets overseas. It has lots of other functions that it performs domestically to make sure that this market stays healthy and grows. And yet, on the other hand, in a completely contrary role, it has responsibility for helping to develop dietary guidelines for what Americans should eat. Mm-hmm. And it finds itself in the uncomfortable position of, on the one hand, having to say people should buy more animal foods, and yet on the other hand, having to acknowledge the science that says But if you eat more animal foods, you'll probably make yourself sick. So maybe you shouldn't do that.
Gotta love those food pyramids they put out.
Yeah. And so many commentators have said, look, it's fine to have a government agency that helps promote industry, but you shouldn't have the same agency also make recommendations to consumers. That should be handled by somebody else. And so there are people who just say USDA should not be involved in developing dietary guidelines. And I agree with that. I think we should just leave that to another agency.
Absolutely.
Sure. It's such a tricky thing, though. It really is.
It is. The animal food industry is enormously powerful in this country. It's a massive industry worth $250 billion each year. And because it creates a lot of jobs, because it spends a lot of money on lobbying, because it donates a lot of money to lawmakers, it has enormous influence at the state and federal level in how laws get made and how regulations get enacted. And it has been very successful at protecting itself and insulating itself from laws and regulations that might tend to diminish its productivity.
Well, and not to mention that, and this has been highlighted in some of the documentaries, that there's laws in place that you can actually be deemed a quote unquote a terrorist for disrupting this industry in a major way. So if you were to attempt to disrupt this industry, that you can go to jail for a very long time and be called a terrorist for doing so.
Oh, that's a great example. Yeah. Something like 2 out of 3 states in this country today have adopted so-called eco-terrorism laws. And these laws say that if somebody in the course of perpetrating what is otherwise a relatively innocuous crime, say vandalism, malicious mischief, or something along those lines, targets a so-called animal enterprise, that is almost anything having to do with animals, a restaurant, a factory farm, a testing facility, whatever, that as a result of targeting that animal enterprise, that relatively innocuous crime is enhanced, and the penalty goes from a relatively innocuous penalty to something much more material. And that person then becomes labeled a terrorist, which is, depending on how you look at it, pretty crazy. In this country, you can bomb an abortion clinic and kill people and not be labeled a terrorist. But if you liberate 10 minks from a mink farm, for example, you will be labeled a terrorist. So go figure.
Well, we better change our weekend plans.
That's right.
Just kidding, kind of. So, what exactly can we do about all of this?
Well, there are a few things that people can do. First of all, on an individual level, we can simply make a decision to either boycott this industry completely and not support it at all, or to simply consume less animal products than we have been. And there is a significant body of research showing that certainly being on a vegan diet is more healthy than an omnivorous diet. The research shows vegans can live about 15% longer. We have something like 15% lower body mass index or weight, and lots of other health benefits. But even just doing like a meatless Monday is shown to have significant health benefits. So if you just cut out meat 1 day per week, it's a great start, not just for your health, but for the environment, for the animals, et cetera.
Well, and I would like to add go ahead, Dave.
Oh, go ahead, because I'll talk about the second approach in more detail. But why don't you make?
I just wanted to expand on your point when you're talking about veganism, and this is something that we've ran into with a lot of our clients and stuff, that people are trying to find this balance, right? So there's different types of vegans, and you can certainly become a junk food vegan where you eat nothing but Oreos all day because, yes, they are vegan. But we want to mention that the importance of consuming more of a whole food plant-based diet would be ideal to keep your risk for heart disease and diabetes at a much lower rate by, consuming more of these, what we said, foods, natural foods.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point.
And I think also, before you move on to your second point, Dave, is like you'd said, even that meatless Monday is making somewhat of an impact. And it's like here we can show people that every step in the right direction is a step that counts, no matter how small it may seem. And whether that's starting off with meatless Mondays for a month or a year, however long that suits you, but then progressing, moving forward, maybe removing cheese from, I don't know, cheeseless Tuesdays or something, and then just
Sure.
slowly building upon that until you feel comfortable enough to, make a full switch someday if that's where you aspire to be.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things that I think people fear about trying veganism or a plant-based diet is that because we're so acculturated and habituated to eating meat and cheese with every meal, because that's what we've done throughout our lives. I did it myself until my early 40s. It's just impossible to contemplate how we would eat a meal without those things in it. And until you've actually done that a few times and seen how easy it can be a daunting task.
Absolutely.
So that's why something as simple as trying to cut just a particular category of food out of your diet 1 or 2 days a week can be a great start, because then you can see, oh, it's not so hard. And in fact, if you don't eat dairy-based cheese, there are lots of other great healthy cheeses out there that are just made out of cashews or other nut products. Super healthy, taste great, but they don't contribute to heart disease. They don't cause animals to be hyper confined for their entire lives, and they're just a great alternative.
Yeah, very good point. And they are very, very delicious.
Shout out to Miyoko's, one of my favorites.
Oh yeah, yes, mine too.
So what was that second point you were going to bring up about what we can do about all of these problems?
Well, the second thing is that, as we have seen with tobacco, and as I mentioned, as we were discussing tobacco, when you tax a good, when you impose a government-sponsored tax on it, you increase the retail price of that good, and that decreases its consumption. And in the case of tobacco, taxes have been enormously successful at reducing consumption. And I think that we need to, and likely we will at some point in this country, tax animal foods. We tax other socially undesirable goods because we want to reduce their consumption. That's why we tax tobacco, we tax alcohol, we tax gasoline. We want people to consume less of these things, not more. And for the same reason, we need to start taxing animal foods. The research that I've done shows that if we were, for example, to impose a 50% tax on all foods that contain any animal products, we would see something like a 44% reduction in consumption. And that would have just tremendous benefits for us socially.
I wonder how angry people would be if we did this.
Well, look, people were angry when we taxed tobacco. Tobacco farmers were not happy about it. We used to subsidize tobacco farming in this country. We only stopped that about 20 years ago. But we need to stop subsidizing animal foods too. And I'm sure that producers will not be happy about that, but it needs to be done.
Couldn't agree more. Definitely.
Well, I do think on a lighter note and more positive note that we are moving in the right direction for our health and for, more people that seem to be consuming more of a plant-friendly diet. And I think this grassroots movement is really taking off, and I really am excited to see what the future has in store for us.
I agree. We're already seeing consumption declining on a year-over-year basis, and many commentators think that is directly related to the success of the vegan movement. I think we're increasingly seeing the medical community take notice that plant-based foods are healthier for us than animal-based foods. And I think that eventually, when it becomes a standard of care in this country to recommend a plant-based diet to people, particularly those who have diseases known to be caused by animal food consumption, like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease, when that becomes a standard of care, we will see policymakers follow through and start to enact laws and regulations that target animal food consumption and that attempt to reduce consumption in this country.
Absolutely. It's so exciting.
Yes, we're definitely on a path that has great cause for optimism.
So Dave, what are you up to these days? If people want to follow you and see what you've got in store, what's going on in your life?
Well, I don't have any new books planned, although I probably will do something in the future. But as I'm a lawyer and interested in protecting animals, I continue to have a caseload targeting animal abusers and targeting venues that try to suppress expressive activity that animal advocates are trying to engage in. So I'm suing a bunch of shopping malls in Southern California. I'm suing foie gras producers in New York. And I've got some other lawsuits on the horizon where I'm trying to make life a little better.
That's awesome. You're doing the dirty work that I think a lot of people would be too intimidated to bring on themselves.
Well, it's I've been practicing law for almost 30 years, and for me, this is the stuff that is the most rewarding and that brings me the most satisfaction. So I'm actually relieved that I got into it and that I now have a way to do it.
That's really cool. Fantastic work.
Yeah, we admire what you're doing and keep it up. We're going to be following you, and I'm encouraging our listeners to check out your book, Meatonomics, and to follow you as well.
Super.
Thank you so much, Dave, for coming on to the show. We really enjoyed talking.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, and thanks for your interest in the subject.
Absolutely. Well, if that doesn't get the gears turning in your head, I don't know what will. Thank you, Dave Simon, for all of those wonderful facts.
Much love from Soul and Wonder.
So, guys, since we're on the vegan subject matter, I'd like to introduce to you the health tip of the episode. How to make your vegan diet even healthier. And this is something that a lot of people get a little bit upset about, but this is something that you should consider. Cooking without oil. Yes, that's right. No olive oils, no vegetable oils, not even coconut oil. Guys, you don't need it. It's great for your skin, it's great for your hair, but you don't need to eat it. And there are plenty of peer-reviewed studies to prove so. Now, a few facts that you might want to know about oils. Vegetable oils, this has everything to do with olive and coconut, have more than twice the calorie density of refined sugar. Vegetable oils contain almost no vitamins, minerals, or fiber. And olive oil is, in fact, harmful to your arteries. And we'll include in our show notes 2 videos, one from Dr. Clapper and one from Dr. Esselstyn, explaining their take on olive oil so that you can further do your research. And guess what? The Mediterranean diet was only healthy because it was mainly plant-based, not because of the copious amounts of olive oil that they ingested. Whole plant foods contain all of the essential fats that our bodies require, so no need to worry. Now, my favorite method for cooking without oils is using veggie broth or splashes of water in a nice toxic-free nonstick pan. It cooks your vegetables the same. Any recipe, you can just take out that oil, sometimes just add veggie broth in place. Sometimes you don't need any of it at all. Of course, you want to test the waters and see what works for you. But we've found throughout our whole food plant-based journey that not only are our energy levels are higher without oils, we don't break out anymore like I used to. I can tell a significant difference when we go out to eat because, of course, they're going to have oil in that food. Sometimes I'll break out in pimples almost immediately.
Not only that, but feel really sluggish, feel bloated. You really notice the difference once you switch and you get off of oils. Of course, going out to eat, it's tough to avoid. And it's something that, we cook a lot. So being at home, we can avoid it as much as we can. But, of course, there's those times where we do go out to eat and we want to be around friends and family.
Absolutely. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about these studies that claim that oils are not, in fact, good for you, we'll also include the link for you to click on really helpful websites that we've done our own research from. So that is that. Oils stay on your skin, not in your body. Eat your avocados, eat your nuts, eat your seeds, whatever it is.
Yes, and be sure to join our free Facebook group called Transitioning to a Whole Food Plant-Based Lifestyle. This is for those people that are curious interested in transitioning, or for those that have already made the transition and just want to share a little bit of wisdom and knowledge with others.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you. Just go to our Facebook at Soul and Wonder Inc. and you'll find our group linked to our business Facebook page. Send a request to join and we'll accept that ASAP.
Yes.
Awesome.
I think this concludes this episode, and we will see you around soon.
Catch you later.